Hey guys, so for June and July, we're going to be talking about emotion regulation skills. And today I thought we'd get started with the opposite action because it has so many different applications for kind of whatever emotion that you struggle with, and it's just one that can be beneficial for all people. So remember, our emotion regulation skills are our everyday, all the time skills, but they're for when our emotions are not overpowering our logical function. So if we're thinking about our emotions on a scale of 1 to 10, we typically use our emotion regulation skills from 1 to about 6 or 7. So just keep that in mind as we're talking about these skills the next few weeks. Opposite action is based off of the idea that we find in DBT that our emotions have these very distinct parts to them, and that an emotional experience has like all these separate pieces. And so the opposite action skill lands on the urge part of the emotion. And so kind of when we're thinking about emotions, we have vulnerability factors, which are everything that we come into the situation beforehand, anything that makes us less than capable of regulating our emotions. So think of like being tired or having a really stressful relationship with this particular person that you're in a conversation with. So lots of history, being under the influence of alcohol or drugs, those are all vulnerability factors. The thing that starts our emotional experience is called the prompting event. After that, we have interpretations, so how we think about it. We have physiological changes that happen like internally, rate of heart, breath, adrenaline, norepinephrine, all that chemical stuff that goes on. And then we have our outward expression. And before our outward expression, we have thoughts that are urges, like I'm going to do this thing. Like with anger, a lot of times our action urge is to Hulk smash, right? To get up and do whatever aggressive thing that might be. With sadness, a lot of times our action urge is to like crawl in bed and put the covers over our head. So all emotions have action urges associated with them, but sometimes it's not helpful to follow through on those action urges. So there are 4 different situations that we can use opposite action for. And that's where we're going to start off today, is talking about like when are the times that it makes sense to use this skill. So the first time we would use opposite action is when the emotion doesn't fit the facts. And in DBT, there's this wonderful little worksheet that I'll link in the bottom that is like emotions that fit the facts. So for example, sadness makes sense. It fits the facts when things are not as you wanted or hoped them to be. Anger fits the facts when a goal is being blocked. Just a nice little reference point to go back. But sometimes we feel emotions and they don't fit the facts. Here's a good example. Love fits the facts when being with that person or thing increases the likelihood that we are living in alignment with our goals. And so a lot of times we've experienced love with people that don't do that, right? So sometimes emotions don't fit the facts. That's a really good time to use opposite action, because if it doesn't fit the facts, it doesn't make sense to act on that action urge. The second time we would use opposite action is when the emotion does fit the facts, but the intensity is way higher than the current situation it calls for. And this tends to happen when we have lots of vulnerability factors. So we have lots of other things going on that have like made our emotions be much more extreme in the current situation than the current situation actually calls for. The third time we would use it is when our history is affecting our current intensity. So this is also an intensity one. So think of like when you have had a trauma trigger, right? And you are going about your day-to-day life and suddenly there's a sensation or a thought or, you know, whatever that like brings you full on into a bad experience from the past. That's a time to use opposite action because we're feeling the intensity of our emotion, but it's not really based on this current situation. It's not based on the present moment. And the fourth time we use opposite action is when the emotion is justified, but acting on the urge would create bigger problems for us. Back to our anger example. A lot of times anger is justified because we can figure out what goal is being blocked. But we have that human like Hulk smash response, and that doesn't help us problem solve, right? Like Hulk smash very rarely helps us get the goal unblocked. So that's another time when acting on the urge would actually create more problems for us. So those are the times we would use opposite action. Now we're going to go through and talk about 6 emotions that we use it for, and what their typical action urge is, and how we can go about and rewrite it to a more effective action urge. So we start with fear because that's a really easy one. Most people can relate to anxiety. Even if you don't have a trauma past, we live in a time of life where like Anxiety is part of the human condition. So anxiety, the action urge associated with anxiety typically is to avoid. And the example I like to give with this is that I have developed a huge fear of the flyovers on the highways since COVID started. And I could tell you, like, it definitely started in spring of 2020 when there was zero traffic on roads that you are used to being like really congested. And so in the past, I'd always like followed the car in front of me with my eyes, and that's how I kept from having vertigo. Without a car in front of me, got really bad vertigo, and it's a problem that has consisted even after the traffic has come back. So my anxiety urge, and there's a couple of really specific ones, one being 99 and 45 going north. Hugely big curve. Another one is Beltway 8 and I-10. Oh, they're awful. And so like 5 minutes beforehand, my anxiety starts going off and my action urge is to avoid it. And so you can't avoid it, right? You get off the freeway and you go through the intersection and then you get back on the other freeway. But if I did this every time, this could easily cost me 15 minutes every time I did one of these, and like would really negatively impact what is already a like stressful travel living and navigating Houston. And so like I don't want to create that fear maintenance. So when my action urge to avoid comes up, I have to have this conversation in my head, like that would be not a wise decision. And what am I going to do? I'm going to approach the thing that my anxiety wants me to avoid. And that's opposite action. And while I'm going over the thing, which is like a less than 30-second block of time, I'm doing my opposite action and I'm saving myself all that time I would be like sitting and navigating lights to do it. And so that is like a real world adaptation of how I use this skill in my life. So if you fear, what is the thing that you want to avoid? Is there an actual threat to your life? I know that there's not a danger in the flyovers. It looks like a danger, but I'm not actually going to go off the side of it. And if there's not an actual threat, then I'm going to do that opposite action. I'm going to approach. Okay, so moving on to our second emotion, which is sadness. So sadness is a justified emotion if things are not as we wanted or hoped them to be. Like anger, we can almost always say sadness fits the facts because we can almost always track it back to that thing not being the way we expected it to be. The action urge associated with sadness is actually inaction, right? It's inertia. It's like crawling in bed, turning on that old TV show that we've watched a million times and not engaging in life. What happens when we do that is we keep sadness like refiring itself in a perpetual loop, right? Inactivation breeds more inactivation. So the opposite action for sadness is to get up and do anything. And it truly can be anything. A lot of times if we deal with chronic depression, we struggle with this thought process of like, oh, if I'm going to do anything, then it needs to be the things I'm supposed to do, those things that I'm really behind on, those things that matter the most. And what happens is that thought process actually keeps us in that inertia place. Versus if we get up and we do anything, it's called behavior activation. There's a whole treatment for depression called behavior activation. We're beating the inertia and we're starting what can be a ripple effect, right? Because if I get up and I do something, I have changed the hormones that are flowing in my body for one. And I'm like that first thing I get done, then I create a reward in my brain, and that reward in my brain makes me more likely to follow things through on other things. And so if you struggle with sadness, if depression is your problem emotion, really give yourself permission that the first thing you do doesn't have to be something you're supposed to do. It can be a simple thing that brings you joy and pleasure. Okay, our third emotion we're going to talk about is anger. The anger is justified if a goal is being blocked. Our action urge associated with it is typically aggression, posturing up, trying to like get bigger. In many situations in modern life, anger is justified. Acting on the action urges do not do anything to get us closer to what we need or want. So opposite action for anger is compassion. So in the most extreme form, this would be going up and hugging a person that you want to scream at. For many of this is not the level that we are at in our journey. And so if compassion to you means disengaging, right? Like I want to scream at you, so I'm just going to go away. Also, another trick we can use in this moment is that like compassion means treating a person like we would a toddler, right? Like just kind of giving them the like they don't understand. And I wouldn't scream at a 2-year-old who doesn't understand, so I'm not going to scream at this adult person. Could also be something like a loving kindness meditation, right? In the moment, I don't feel like I can give you compassion, but I am later in a time where I'm more regulated, going to put that energy out into the universe for you because my anger was pretty negative energy. Okay, so the next three that we're going to talk about are love, guilt, and shame. And those are all very much interpersonal, right? So love is a justified emotion when being with the person improves our quality of life or increases our likelihood of attaining important goals. For those of us who have had stressful childhoods, we've often seen love as like accepting bad things from people. We conflate love and abuse, being treated badly, having our flaws pointed out, whatsoever. Those things. So when we determine love doesn't fit the facts, so when love does fit the facts, what do we want to do? The action or urge of love is to spend as much time with as possible, to be as connected as possible, right? But when we've decided that the person or thing, because it can also be a thing like a drug of choice, a hobby that we're obsessed with that's like got our life out of balance, when we've decided that that thing doesn't fit the facts and we're choosing not to love it anymore because it's going to increase our likelihood of reaching our own personal goals, having a life we deserve of peace, of happiness, then the opposite action for love is complete disconnection. And this is important in a modern world because there are so many ways that somebody that we have decided doesn't belong in our life anymore can accidentally creep in. And when we think of like emotions, could have a day where we see them and, triggers big emotions. And so we want to prevent as much of that as possible. And what that looks like is really fully disconnecting on social media. And I think a lot of times we forget how like interwoven our lives can be. You've got your main, like your Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Facebook, but the Snapchat, and then you've got maybe location shared somewhere. And you want to go through when you're in your wise mind, when you're regulated, and disconnect all of these things so that you're preventing on a day when you have those big vulnerability factors that thing doesn't accidentally come up and trigger for you. You want to create as full closure as possible. It's full opposite action for love. Okay, our last two are guilt and shame. Guilt and shame are very much interpersonal, right? Guilt has to do if we have acted against our own value system, and it helps to us to calibrate that we want to keep our behaviors within our value system. Shame has to do with fear of being excluded from the group. And evolutionary shame had a huge role in life because if you're part of the tribe and you go and eat the whole store of fruit for the entire tribe, then you've created a likelihood that everybody else could suffer and possibly face extinction. So you would get rejected from the tribe, expelled. Modern life, there's not near as much actual threat to death from shame. And yet we still live in a society that is steeped in shame, right? So much of our culture and capitalism and how it keeps us within the systems that we exist within is based on keeping us at pretty high levels of shame all the time. But both of these emotions, the action urge associated with them is typically to hide the things, right? I hide the behaviors I don't like about myself. I hide the things about myself that I am afraid would get me kicked out of my group, either physically or emotionally, right? Excommunicated. And so our opposite action for when these things come up and when we're having that oh, I'm the nastiest, I'm the gnarliest, we're just, self-flagellating. Just those things, the opposite action is to tell a trusted individual who is not going to shame you, but who can act as outside accountability, right? And to help you problem solve and brainstorm and say these are the behaviors that came out in me. These are the consequences I'm worried that this behavior could have for my life. And can you help me figure out how to stop the behaviors before they become consequences? And could I call you in the future before the behaviors actually manifest so that maybe, I don't have to complete this cycle again? So that really is how we use opposite action for all these different emotions. And maybe you struggle with just one really big negative emotion, right? Anger, sadness, anxiety, totally possible. Or maybe you see how you can apply this for all sorts of emotions that come up just in your day-to-day life. It's a great skill because it's really, it's simple. Break it down. What is the action urge that is associated with the emotion I'm feeling? Does that help me? have the life I want to live? And if not, then I'm just going to go ahead and do the opposite action. And let me know, like, what ways are you using this in your life, and how has it helped you out? I'd love to hear.